Ukraine war's origin has roots in the Yalta Conference. AI generated. The Cold War, a prolonged period of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, began shortly after World War II ended. It originated from a complex mix of ideological, political, and military factors that emerged during and after the war, notably highlighted during the Yalta Conference in February 1945. This analysis will delve into the significant events and causes that led to the start of the Cold War, drawing insights from the document Roosevelt, Yalta, and the origins of the Cold War and other historical contexts. The Yalta Conference, which took place in February 1945, laid the groundwork for the Cold War by dividing influence in post-war Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. Although the Allied leaders agreed on the necessity of free elections in these regions, the Soviet Union's interpretation of this commitment resulted in the establishment of pro-Soviet communist governments, causing concern in the West and breeding distrust. This divergence in the interpretation and execution of agreements formed the basis for the ideological and geopolitical rivalry that defined the Cold War. Ideological differences. At the heart of the Cold War were stark ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. The US championed capitalism and democracy, advocating for individual freedoms and market economies. In contrast, the Soviet Union promoted communism, emphasizing state control over the economy and a one-party system that suppressed dissent. These conflicting ideologies created a fundamental distrust between the two nations, which was exacerbated by the events of World War II. The Yalta Conference. During the Yalta Conference, which was attended by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, a pivotal moment occurred in shaping post-war Europe. While the leaders intended to talk about the restructuring of Europe and the promotion of peace, their divergent visions for the future became evident. Stalin aimed to increase Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, considering it crucial for the security of the Soviet Union. Stalin believed that the Americans and British had recognized his supremacy in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was more optimistic about the potential for cooperation and the establishment of democratic governments in Eastern Europe. He proposed a new commission to balance the Lublin government with other parties, hoping to appease Stalin while maintaining some semblance of democratic governance. However, this approach was ultimately ineffective, as Stalin was determined to solidify his control over the region, leading to a significant rift between the Allies. The Percentages Agreement. Another pivotal moment was the Percentages Agreement between Churchill and Stalin, which divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This agreement, made in private discussions, reflected a pragmatic approach to post-war politics that sidelined Roosevelt's ideals of international cooperation. Churchill and Stalin's willingness to negotiate without US involvement indicated a growing divide among the Allies and foreshadowed the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. Post-war realities and Soviet expansion. As World War II ended, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower with significant territorial gains. Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe, including the establishment of communist governments in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, alarmed Western leaders. The Soviet Union's refusal to allow free elections in these countries contradicted the agreements made at Yalta and fueled fears of a broader communist expansion. By the end of the Yalta Conference, Stalin had transformed his international position, effectively dominating Eastern Europe and disregarding the needs of his allies. The Truman Doctrine and Containment. The US response to Soviet expansion was articulated in the Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947. President Harry S. Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, adopted a more confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. The doctrine asserted that the US would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, effectively committing the US to a policy of containment. This marked a significant shift from Roosevelt's more conciliatory approach, and set the stage for US involvement in various conflicts around the world, including Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan. In addition to military containment, the US implemented the Marshall Plan in 1948, providing economic aid to Western European countries to help rebuild their economies and prevent the spread of communism. This initiative was seen as a direct challenge to Soviet influence, as it aimed to strengthen democratic governments and promote economic stability in Europe. The Soviet Union viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to undermine its influence in Eastern Europe, further escalating tensions between the two superpowers. The Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade in 1948 to 1949 was another critical event that exemplified the growing divide between East and West. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency in West Germany, Stalin responded by blockading West Berlin, cutting off all ground access to the city. In response, the US and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city with food and fuel for nearly a year. This confrontation solidified the division of Germany and marked a significant escalation in Cold War tensions. The arms race and military alliances. Throughout the Cold War, the superpowers were locked in an arms race, advancing their nuclear arsenals and military prowess. NATO's creation in 1949, as a collective defense of Western nations, was met with the Warsaw Pact's formation in 1955, crystallizing Europe's division into two rival camps. This escalation in military preparedness deepened the ideological rift and paved the way for several proxy conflicts worldwide. Following the Soviet Union's dissolution in the early 1990s, a fleeting era of hope and collaboration emerged between Russia and the West. Nonetheless, as NATO began to include former Soviet and Warsaw Pact nations, tensions rekindled. Russia viewed this enlargement as an encroachment on its dominion and a threat to its security, reigniting hostilities akin to the Cold War period. The ongoing strife in Ukraine is an extension of these enduring Cold War tensions. Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 and its backing of separatist factions in eastern Ukraine are seen as attempts to reaffirm its sway over an area it deems crucial for its protection and historical roots. Conversely, the West's backing of Ukraine signifies a re-escalation of the standoff with Russia, mirroring the Cold War's ideological confrontations. Conclusion. The agreements made at the Yalta Conference and the subsequent failure to uphold democratic principles in Eastern Europe set the stage for the Cold War. The current situation in Ukraine is a manifestation of these historical tensions, demonstrating how the past continues to influence present-day geopolitical conflicts. Looking back, we can now understand how the Ukraine War and the Yalta Conference are interconnected. The Cold War arose from a complex mix of ideological differences, geopolitical strategies, and historical events that unfolded during and after World War II. The Yalta Conference underscored the differing visions for the post-war world, while Stalin's aggressive expansionism and the US response to the Truman doctrine and the Marshall Plan deepened the divide. The Berlin Blockade and the ensuing arms race further solidified the conflict, ushering in a prolonged era of tension that would shape global relations for years to come. Understanding these roots is essential for grasping the dynamics of the Cold War and its enduring impact on international politics.